Hey everybody, this is Tim Chavez from Faith Matters. Our guest today is a longtime friend and collaborator, and an incredibly unique voice in the Latter-day Saint tradition, Thomas McConkie. Thomas is an author, developmental researcher, and meditation teacher who's been practicing under masters in the traditions of Sufism, Buddhism, and Christian contemplation, among others, for over 25 years. Thomas is the founder of Lower Light School of Wisdom and is currently researching and writing on transformative spiritual practice at Harvard Divinity School. He's also the author of a brand new book published by Faith Matters Publishing called At-One-Ment, Embodying the Fullness of Human-Divinity. This is, in our opinion, a monumentally important work, and one that has the capacity to powerfully change the way we see the world. The book reminds us that much of Christianity has spent centuries focusing on what to believe. Thomas redirects this conversation to the simple but potent practices we can engage in body, heart, mind, and spirit to awaken us to a greater measure of the sacred right here and now. At-One-Ment becomes a spiritual reality in which we can all participate, not just a historical event in which a select few believe. In our conversation, we covered some important themes from the book, including how we can all at once seek transformation and already feel whole, how we are both individuals and yet deeply connected to everything and everyone around us, and how the mind, while indispensable and so prominent in our modern society, is far from the only way of knowing. We really encourage you to pick up this book. It's available now on Amazon, and we think it makes a great gift as well. And as a note for those interested, Thomas will also be leading a 3-day retreat in Salt Lake City in May 2024, diving deeper into the concepts behind At-One-Ment. Please check out the episode notes for more details. Thanks so much, as always, for listening, and we really hope that you enjoy this conversation with Thomas McConkie. Okay, Thomas McConkie, thank you so much for joining us again. It's always a pleasure to have you here.
It's amazing to be with you too.
We are so excited to talk about this book that you've written that was recently published, At-One-Ment. I think it's truly a monumental work. It resonated so deeply with Aubrey and with me, and we're so proud to be part of Faith Matters that was a part of publishing this book as well. It felt like, honestly, reading it was just what I needed at the time.
Oh, wow. Thank you.
And I think a lot of listeners will feel that as well. I wanted to start by asking you about not about the title, but sort of like, let's start there.
Yeah.
At-One-Ment.
Yeah.
And obviously read atonement, that brings up so much for so many people, especially in the Latter-day Saint tradition.
I know. What were we thinking naming a book that? Let's put a big bullseye on our head right out of the gate.
Obviously when you read the book, though, you understand why it's named that. But if I were a consumer looking at this book on the shelves and I see atonement, I might think, oh, this is going to be a deep dive into atonement theory.
Right.
Or, this is going to talk about Jesus Christ's sacrifice, death on the cross, suffering in the garden. The title of the book, though, it seems to be addressing something a little bit different than what you might expect, and the message of the book is a little bit different than what you might expect, while being deeply rooted in faith. Could you talk about what to you that primary message of the book is?
Yeah, well, I think that's a really fair assessment. At-One-Ment felt like the right title. My own background in faith, my own spiritual formation, it brought me to a personal insight that once I had this insight, I felt just this unbelievable desire to share it, really. So the book, it comes from my own spiritual insight that really changed my life, and I felt it had the power to really deepen faith in our community. And that insight was the spiritual experience of wanting to become one with. And I talk about this in the book, that can be anything. We can become one with the parts of ourselves we struggle to love. We can be one with the people in our lives that we struggle to love, not to mention the people we don't struggle to love. We can be one with them in heart and mind and soul and spirit. And we can have life-changing experiences becoming one with the divine. A lot of people know that I have a lot of experience in the Eastern traditions where oneness is actually like very much on their radar. It's a spiritually significant experience that they spend a lot of time cultivating. And when I brought those fresh eyes to our tradition, to the restored gospel, I realized we know this and we care about it as much as anybody. Not only that, but we have a unique voice in this. Like I believe there are gifts and unique perspectives, insights, and possibilities, like through our particular revelation, our stream of wisdom, you could say, that I just want to share so much with others. So a lot of the book was like taking what in my heart has been life-changing in terms of my own faith and my own development and formation, and how to language that in a way that, like, I really tried to discipline myself and look like, what's here, what's the toil, what's the soil that I can really work until right here, not trying to draw like Buddhist mindfulness in and you know, fine, I'm as big a fan as anybody of the traditions, but I want to see what we already have right here and to develop that so that as a worshiping body, we have more of a language and more of a heightened awareness of like, wow, we can be one heart, one mind. In fact, we are already more one heart, one mind than we realize. We're already more of a Zion people than we realize.
I love that. I have a propensity, I think, for feeling existential overwhelm whenever I start a book that has something to do with growth. And so it felt like you maybe sensed that, because right in the beginning, you sort of talk about this idea of intuitive transformation. And that just calmed everything down for me. And I'd love for you to talk about that before we really get into the meat of the book, because it was such an important page for me. And I think my habit is to, I literally, always read with a notebook and I'm making lists. And so this idea that like, you're going to read and just recognize what I think you call it tasting good, like what just feels delicious to you and what do you recognize in yourself that's really lighting up. And maybe that's the one thing that you're going to take. So maybe just, can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, I feel really encouraged that you enjoyed that page and took that message from the book, because I really intended to write the book of anti-lists. My sense in our culture is that we feel like pretty bogged down and inadequate to the task of constantly improving ourselves. So I'm really serious when I won't talk about the book. Like right now, between me and you, I've found that the most powerful orientation towards our spirituality and our being is to start from wholeness, actually take ourselves to be whole right now and learn a new rhythm of, we could say, growth, development, expansion, where like we're overflowing into the next embodiment. We're not seeking for something because we're broken and lacking. We're already whole. We're already made of the divine substance. And when we establish ourselves in that identity, we just overflow. It's our nature to overflow and to give ourselves fully away. It feels so much different to live a life that way.
Yeah. The phrase that really resonated with me around that same part was, I think you said, we don't have to hate ourselves forward anymore. That was really,
honestly, trying to be really dramatic, like really put a fine point.
I mean, at the same time, like that resonated deeply for me. Like especially like as a young person in the church, as a missionary, I think I was hating myself forward in a lot of ways.
And as we mature spiritually, we realize like hating ourselves forward is a total contradiction. It's an oxymoron, because when we're supposedly moving forward by like, cracking the whip and denying ourselves basic comforts and kindness, the fruit of our spiritual life is actually that lack of kindness. Like that's actually what we're making more of. Yeah. We have to, if we don't start with wholeness, we won't somehow arrive at wholeness from fragmentation. It's got to be now.
What is it about your faith or your experience that says it's not a danger to growth to tell people that they already are enough, that they already are whole, and that whatever they need is going to flow to them?
This is tricky. Let me kind of make a prefatory remark that I wanted to say at the beginning of this conversation. I'm in a difficult moment with this book because, like, more than anything I've ever shared, it represents what I deeply care about in human life and the body of the saints and all human beings and all beings. I could hardly care more about it. And I've never felt so inadequate to try to talk about it. Like, nothing I've said in the book is quite it. And now I'm like seeing copies of it floating around, and cousins and neighbors like, hey, I got your book in the mail. And I'm like, there's a part of me that's just like, I hope I've even captured a sliver of the wholeness and the oneness that cannot be named. It's too full, it's too whole, it's too one to even name. So I'm very self-conscious about how inadequate the book is on that level. And I say that to, kind of as a like prefatory response to your question, because when you ask that question about wholeness, like, what in your experience tells you it's okay to just be whole and that won't prevent future growth, it won't stymie your sense of motivation, I don't have adequate words for it. I know at the level of the mind, we're so accustomed to feeling like we lack and therefore set a goal and work towards it. That is the most natural way in the world to get somewhere. Like I say it and your heads are nodding. It's like, yeah, how else could you possibly think about it? And what I've found just in the living of it and in the modeling of it from, mature spiritual beings in my life, both on this side of the veil and the other, it's that and again, the word's inadequate, but if you can touch into your divine wholeness, even just a drop, just taste it with the tip of your tongue, you will be so overjoyed with divine power. The most spontaneous movement in the world will be to give everything you have to share it, which is like the very definition of the Christlike service we aspire to, I think, in our tradition. So logic would tell me, well, if I'm already whole, I'm just going to sit around and be complacent. But the lived experience of it for me has been when I really feel my own wholeness, I realize in a direct way that no matter how much I give, I'll always have more. The more I give, the more I have to give. And that's a dimension, I think, of the gospel that is so present in our restored gospel. But there isn't as much language around it.
Yeah. It feels to me like one of the first things that comes up is that we really can very easily get trapped in words, trapped in our minds, and
Right.
trapped in the list, like you're saying. And so one of the first things that you explore is these other ways of knowing. And for me, that there were several moments in the book where I felt like that sort of took over inside the book. Like it stopped being a list in my mind even, and I felt like you were telling a story or talking about some sort of experience that gave me the feeling of this expansion that you're talking about. And one of those moments was when you talk about other ways of knowing, and specifically the way our bodies and our hearts can actually comfort and succor people who are suffering. And that
Right.
maybe it was toward the end of the chapter, but for me, that moment in imagining what it can look like to do something besides talk to someone, like how
Right.
healing using your body or using your heart can be, just it felt like a moment inside a moment where like my body was recognizing truth. Like I could feel myself light up about something that I don't think I'd ever quite articulated. And so can we talk about other ways of knowing? And I think we're pretty comfortable with this mind knowing and using words to worship and using words to do just about everything. But what does a heart knowing look like? And what does knowing with our body look like?
Yeah, thank you. Well, again, I'm encouraged that the experience of being in the book pointed to something beyond the words. In the book, I talk about the wisdom, the intelligence of the body, the heart, the mind, and also the spirit, just what we call in Latter-day Saint theology, pure intelligence or light. And it seems pretty apparent to me. I've been involved in developmental studies and research for a long time. We not only look at individuals and how individuals develop, but we look at cultures and we look at civilizations and we look at epochs. We look at development across time. And it seems very clear to me that we have an unusual bias in our current modern world around what can I say to point to it? Rational thinking, knowing, the logical, linear, scientific mind, that whole thing that really came to ascendancy in the European Enlightenment. We're creatures of this kind of cultural container. So we think it's very normal to think about things. We think it's very normal to relate to ourselves like via the thinking mind. And that is incredibly powerful and incredibly limiting. And in the book, I've tried to point to and invoke, more than describe it, like invoke it. Like, can you just smell the perfume of the fullness of divine embodiment? And like, how many countless strata of body, heart, mind, soul, spirit, and beyond that we are. This is our reality. And we can't even begin to fathom it with the mind, but we participate in these realities. Let me tell a story to make it really vivid. I had a difficult relationship with my granddad, McConkie. And it was a relationship neither of us quite knew how to work out in this lifetime. And one night I had a dream, which actually it was about my grandfather's father, Oscar Sr. And interestingly, that it occurs to me in the moment, Oscar Sr. would talk about like these very spiritually potent dreams as night visions. He didn't call them dreams, he'd call them night visions if you had a spiritual experience in a dream. I don't think he coined that. I think that's doctrinal and scriptural, but just a detail I'm remembering. At any rate, I never met Oscar Sr. when he was alive, but in this dream, I was in my grandparents' kitchen of all places, and Oscar Sr., who I never met in the body, he descended like an angel in the dream, and he was translated. He was recognizable. The moment I saw him, I'm like, Oscar, like, you know, like he was more clear to me in the dream than you two are, as I'm staring at you right now. And his presence was potent. Like I knew I was in the presence of a being who was light years, just exalted, like in the process of his eternal progression, that he was wise, and his love was potent, and just being in his presence transformed me. And I woke up from that dream like I hadn't even been dreaming. It's like I opened my eyes and I couldn't even tell like what was wake and what was sleep, kind of moment. And I never felt the same way about my granddad again. Not only did I get to meet my great granddad in that dream, but this man who I think I had hard feelings towards, I had a hard time forgiving. In a moment, I just recognized like we are in this process that is eternal and unfathomable. And what my great grandfather communicated to me from beyond the veil, just a split second, with the force of his heart and his presence, said more than I could ever describe in a million years about it. That's what I'm talking about in the book, that when we're willing to just turn the volume down a little bit on the mind, we still want the mind, it still does beautiful things, but when we turn the volume down on the mind, we receive these impressions, these revelations that are completely life-changing. And, you know, for my money, I think God just loves it when we're willing to listen to that.
Thank you for sharing that very, very sacred experience.
Yeah.
I thought it might be really interesting, and this is just something that came up for me as I was reading the book, to talk a little bit about what is maybe the most commonly cited Latter-day Saint sort of like epistemological method, which is Moroni's promise in Moroni 10. And just to give you like a little indication of how I thought about Moroni's promise, since I was maybe a 12-year-old who had just completed reading the Book of Mormon for the first time. I thought what's going to happen here is I'm going to get on my knees and pray, and I'm going to feel some sensation, or best case scenario, see some vision, or maybe hear a voice. If not, burning in the bosom, and that is then going to be sufficient evidence for me in my mind to say, okay, these things are true. By the Holy Ghost, you shall know the truth of all things. And it was going to be the Holy Ghost essentially giving me sort of like taking my mind to that courtroom, giving me the evidence I needed, and I can render a verdict.
Yeah.
very mind-oriented way of looking at
Sure.
that
Yeah.
promise. Is
Yeah.
there a more subtle or potentially more mature way to look at that promise?
I don't know. I mean, in the sense that I really love what you're saying and honor it. Everything you said is a yes to me, right? Like that
Mm.
process you described has so much maturity and integrity that it is good as far as I can see in and of itself. And for anybody who has intuitions around something else kind of brewing, smoldering in their spiritual lives, I might suggest that sometimes we get a burning in the bosom and we mistake our mental furniture for the proof that that burning was true. In other words, we quickly settle into beliefs and ideas that we've carried with us for a long time. And in my experience, the transformative process sooner or later just completely incinerates those forms. I mean, in other words, there's no place we can just hang out and say like, cool, I got the blueprint of like all three kingdoms. And if I just follow this map, my experience is in the transformative process, like as our faith deepens, our willingness to just not know also deepens. So I don't know if I've articulated that adequately, but I'd say like the experience you describe is amazing and it's potent. And to me, faith is a free fall. It's being willing to let go of what we thought we knew for something even better and something truer. And that implies that we'll spend long periods in an openness, in a darkness. I wonder what you two make of that.
It's a good question. I mean, I read that verse, Moroni 5, and by the power of the Holy Ghost, I think I cited it incorrectly before. And by the power of the Holy Ghost, you may know the truth of all things. And I don't know. My sense is that, like you said, we certainly shouldn't dishonor what I described. I think it's valid. And you don't do this in the book either. It's you don't dishonor the mind-centered knowing by any means. We just need to elevate the other two maybe a little bit more than we do in our society. That's how I took it. But my sense is that potentially that there's something something underlying those words, something about this phrase, the power of the Holy Ghost, that might mean something beyond, or could for a certain person at a certain point mean something beyond giving you sort of rational evidence about some truth.
Yeah, I agree with that. I just keep coming back to my own experience. I know when I've had really profound spiritual experiences, it's as if I can't really sustain that degree of power, that degree of glory, we could say, quite literally, I think. And I come back into like a more comfortable holding pattern in the mind where it's like, this is what that meant. So I've come to a place in my own spiritual life where, and this is not to denigrate the mind, but I recognize on a certain level that everything I think about God is a form of self-defense. It's like a mask I put on God to make God more knowable and manageable, even though I know in my heart of hearts that God is so awesome and infinite that if I were to open up even 5% more, it would just blow me to smithereens. So that's interesting. I think as a people who believe in eternal progression and theosis, like, what does it mean? I'm just kind of musing here that divine power is in us and through us. It's beckoning us to grow and expand. And we can only tolerate what we can tolerate. That's really humbling to me and interesting to me. And I tell a story in the book about one that many people have heard of Sidney Rigdon and Joseph Smith. To me, it's like such a great story in our tradition that points to this reality that, Joseph, a spiritual giant, like a person we revere, he seemed to just have this incredible gift to dwell in light. And then Sidney Rigdon, his foil in the story, is just like, hanging limp, looking sickly and pale like a rag, the limp rag, I think Philo Dibble describes him. And, in some moments we're Joseph, and in some moments we're Sidney Rigdon. And it's fascinating to me that we can learn to be more fully embodied and to receive more glory in our bodies here and now.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Thank you. Before we move, I want to talk about energy centers, of course, but there's this, I really want to ask you about the Prodigal Son, because
yeah, totally.
I had to really think about this. I read it a couple of times and I realized I think I'm feeling resistance because
yeah.
because I have always related to the story of the older son. And I think I'm just a rule follower. I think I just came with, whatever my makeup is, it's been easier for me to follow the rules. And I think it's kind of just a habit. So I wanted to pause it and really ask myself, like, what is my motivation? Why do I follow the rules? And I can see that the younger son had this really dramatic experience that was humiliating in the best way, that like brought him to God. And it really made me wonder how easy it is to live this unexamined life when rule following comes easy to you. And I think if you're raised in the church, there's probably a lot of people who have that experience that, I'm not really sure why. It's easier to follow the rules. So I talk to anybody who feels like they are the older son, who I think you say, is truly the lost son in this story.
So your struggle, I hear you're not totally contesting my take on the prodigal son. Is that right?
No.
I
felt convicted.
He comes to himself. Like, how much clearer could they make it? This was like, he had a full transformation and change of heart, bam, right there, and he was never the same. And the story ends where he's like celebrating with the Father in the kingdom of glory. It's like, bam. But you know what? So read the book if you want to hear my hot take on the prodigal son. But as you asked that, Aubrey, I'm so glad you asked that, because the scriptural account stops there. Like, as far as I remember, the older son is kind of left outside pouting, and he doesn't get to sing, he doesn't get to dance, he's just kind of bitter. I think my wife would be delighted if I shared this story with you. It's a story from her mission that's really moving to me. But she describes herself as somebody who is just like a total stickler for the rules. Like, if they left their apartment 2 minutes late, she was the one getting on the sisters, because we're not going to get the blessings we need to help all the people out there. Like, she was the drill sergeant. And one time her mission companion had a situation back home. And without even thinking about it, her mission companion just makes a call, just calls up her sister, and they're talking. And Glow describes the situation where she was just in knots. Like, this is not a designated time. It's not Christmas. You cannot be on the phone. And this, as Glow tells the story, this missionary just hits her right between the eyes. And she says, "Sister Pack, it's not about the rules, it's about the people." And Glow's, we're all that older brother outside who's just, we've been trying so hard, and where's our reward? Glow describes in that moment where she knew it was true. She knew she'd missed the whole point, and she had a change of heart right then and there, and her mission was never the same, and she was never the same after that. So in my relationship to that scriptural account, we get to enjoy the prodigal son's return, but in God's ultimate goodness and grace, both the sons and all the daughters come home. There's something that cracks us open, So in my world, I know that older brother at some point realizes, I miss my brother. If I can't celebrate with him right now, what are all these rules worth? Our heart is such that it can't bear to stay outside the divine banquet for long. That's how I take it.
So in your mind, there doesn't need to be a prodigal son type journey in order to eventually at one. Let me
Well,
just name
they're both prodigal
something.
sons. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah.
We're all prodigal.
Okay, a younger son type journey, because like
Yeah, yes,
I'm
for sure.
I'm with Aubrey. I'm
Heaven
with Aubrey
help
on this
us.
one. Yeah, like, and I can tell you, as I read the book, that there arose in me a certain jealousy might be the word, because to me the way I read it was Thomas McConkie is the younger son, and look at these amazing transformative experiences, and as I read this, I was the older son, and to be honest, I felt like, shoot, I'm so sorry. I guess I felt like maybe I had missed out, or I'd, like you related with Glow, that I had missed the point, for so many years. Can you speak to the the guilt of the older son for missing it?
Well, what I can do is speak to the guilt of the younger son. Like, I identify more with that particular son eating corn husks. And although my path has been different than yours, Tim, I can absolutely resonate with the grief and the regret and everything that's come up with the people I've hurt and the opportunities I've missed. So, like, to me, there's this powerful parallel in either path. To me, the story is a testament of how good God actually is. And if I'm the type who can better transform through this path, God and their goodness will give me that path, and vice versa.
Yeah, I think that's right. It sort of speaks to the that great enoughness, that you were talking about.
Yeah.
I think it's always it is. I know that it's always problematic to compare one story to someone else's.
I'm really moved, like, just your moment of revealing yourself and your heart breaking open. It just feels so clear to me that, like, God orchestrates these conditions to bring us to this moment. And God does not care how we get to a broken heart. On a certain level, we all need it a different way. So all I can say is how moved I am by your heart in the moment.
Thank you, Thomas.
Near the beginning of the book, you talk about, I think you call it the glory of now. And I think maybe this is a little bit what you're saying, but there is this, I think there's a tendency to believe that another way or another time will be better for our growth. And it felt like that was a real message of this whole book, that it's always about right now. And like, God is so good, there is not a condition that can't be used to make our lives and ourselves holy. So
it's super annoying when I hear you say it like that. I'm like, oh no, the glory of now. I got to be present and mindful and appreciate what's right here, but I don't appreciate it. Like, it's it's drudgery. I want to just like call that out. And it's holy. The now is, I don't have words for it. I wonder if you do. Like, what about the glory of now struck you?
Well, I'll tell you really specifically. This afternoon, I got a text that was very kind, but it was firmly critical of something that I had spent a lot of energy on, and I felt a lot of resistance to that moment.
Yeah.
But I had.
I'm running through my mind, thinking about the text I sent Aubrey.
Yeah, are you implicated, Tim?
I don't think so.
But I felt like I had, I knew we were going to be talking to you today, so this book was very fresh on my mind. And and there's an exercise or a meditation at some point later in the book, after you address energy centers and these sort of core vulnerabilities that we had.
Right.
And there's this invitation to, instead of closing up when we have that when we have those disturbances, when we recognize a real disturbance inside us, instead just try to stay open and recognize what vulnerabilities feel especially alive.
Yeah.
And so even though it felt like such an exception because I felt really bad, I did try it, and it felt dangerous. Like it genuinely,
Yes.
it
Yeah,
felt
that's
very
right.
foreign to choose to not get busy and not. Well, I think that's what I do, is get really busy in my mind, or I start cleaning, and so there was this strange moment of just sitting and really giving all my attention to what genuinely felt like burning. It felt like there was a small sun in my solar plexus. It was so hot. And then
yes.
it just
Oh, you're in it, Aubrey. You're really doing it.
It was a really incredible experience to just have these two things so fresh right next to each other, because I think otherwise it would be very tempting to just move on. But I felt like what was very alive was this energy center of esteem. You talk about this need for having, people think highly of you. And it was so interesting that a single text could make that feel so threatened. And just by doing the opposite of what felt natural, I really got some clarity about things that often cause disturbances inside me. And it felt encouraging. This is work that is uncomfortable, but also I can feel myself growing through hard things in real time. And that was such a small thing that I wouldn't have thought about at the end of the day, because there
are no small disturbances, right? Like, exactly. I mean, it's of cosmic importance how you relate to your disturbance, it seems to me.
Well, will you say more about energy centers? I know I teased one, esteem, but maybe can you just talk about, what are some of the things that often cause disturbances in us on a daily basis that may distract from this feeling of being at one with the people around us and with God?
So the energy centers, it's a term I picked up from Father Thomas Keating, just a real spiritual giant in the Catholic tradition, the contemplative tradition of Christianity, who died only a few years ago, a real hero of mine. The energy centers point to our core vulnerabilities, really, that if we're present, if we're embodied and paying attention to just moment to moment experience of the day, we'll realize that dozens, who knows, hundreds of times a day, we're disturbed at some level, meaning something touches on our sense of vulnerability and we feel threatened, either a little threatened, like, oh, that text, this person doesn't love me as much as I thought they loved me, or like super threatened, this person I depend on for everything might leave me. All of my life savings that I had to take care of my kids and family are wiped out. Like, we go from a little disturbed to like way disturbed. And if I were to tie it back to the now, it just seems kind of evident to me that as human beings, as natural men and women, we have a deep orientation. Like, anytime we feel disturbed, we do everything we can to escape it. Mm-hmm. And the fact of the matter is 99.9% of the time we feel disturbed, it's not life-threatening. It's not even dangerous. It's just, we don't want to feel this way in the body. So we immediately move towards behaviors that in the short term might relieve the pain a little bit, but in the long term, it trains us to just avoid the moment. We spend a whole lifetime avoiding how this actual now feels, so that, by the time we're however old, like the three of us, like, there's no moment that's quite adequate. We've avoided so many nows that this now is I'm just as ready to avoid this one as the last 10 trillion. And you just described the opposite movement. And it requires this radical orientation or repentance, a total turning of the mind and heart to say, like, whatever is here right now, this text where I just, oh man, like, it hurts. I can't believe my friend said that. Oh, it's this like burning in my chest. Like, you just said it so beautifully. The moment we like turn towards that and open to it, I think we're mimicking something at the heart of our tradition, which I look to Christ's moment in Gethsemane. I mean, talk about more than an unkind text message. Like, it's in the scriptural record itself, where Christ himself says, like, I didn't want this to happen. You know, this great soul and spirit who has so much capacity said, like, not even I wanted this, not even I want to deal with this. Nevertheless, like, if this is the now, like, I'm going to swallow it in one gulp. I'm just going to take it all in. And that was a real epiphany for me in my own spiritual life, when I realized that, like, the micro Gethsemanes, like 100 times a day, 1,000 times a day, there's this bitter cup that I would rather not drink, but just a gesture of turning towards it and taking the cup, it's telling God, like, no, I'm committed to this life. I'm committed to this body, to this experience. I sacralize the moment. I really consecrate it when I open myself to it. And then that, the same way we build a habit of avoiding the now, if you do this for a little while, you get so many nows under your belt. We're like, no, I know what to do when I feel awful. I'm just going to, like, really actually acknowledge how awful I feel right now. And pretty soon we develop this confidence where whatever's happening in the now, I'm bigger than it. I can hold it in my heart and somehow love it even. So it's a radically transformative path that I feel is really deeply grounded in gospel patterns. It's a difficult practice, but it's simple in terms of just the basic, can I be with the truth of what I'm experiencing right now? So there's a lot of that in the book. It seems it's a very practical approach to learning how to be one with right now.
I think it might be a different context, but you talk about this metaphor of falling, and that faith is like a free fall, except that there's no ground. And that feels like the tiny experience of choosing to feel something really awful. It does feel very disorienting, and there's no stopping it, but also you never quite hit the bottom.
Right.
It's okay. And it does feel like something that you could learn to trust by doing it over and over. But it does feel like falling.
Yeah, exactly. That divine confidence, a way a teacher of mine put it, as you go through endless rounds of this embodiment practice, you realize your greatest fears won't destroy you when they come about, and that your greatest hopes won't save you. Like, when your hopes and desires are fulfilled, that comes and goes, and it didn't save you. And your greatest fears, sometimes those happen too, and like those pass too. And we develop divine confidence that way, to just live our lives and to be here for it. It's really powerful.
I wanted to ask about the sort of a polarity that's really at the heart of this book and its message, and that is that all at once, each of us is an individual, but also part of a greater divine whole. Could you, I don't know, I'd love for you to talk about sort of, and those are my words, but like, to the extent you agree with that assessment, like what you mean by that sort of like radical connectedness, because I think we're all much more comfortable generally with the idea that we're individuals. And what's the danger of leaning too far on either side and only sort of embracing one of these truths?
Yeah, that's a really profound question. In a lot of ways we could talk about it. Something that occurs to me, coming full circle in the conversation, when we talk about oneness, when we talk about at-oneing, certainly in the Eastern traditions, Buddhism, Hinduism, etc., there's a they wouldn't call it a theology, but there's a basic worldview that, like, the self just disappears into the one. And that's a whole story that we don't need to get into. But I bring it up because it's very distinct from, I think, how, as Latter-day Saints, we understand what at-one-ment means. And it's exactly what you named, this polarity that somehow we can be absolutely one heart, one mind, one body in Christ, in sacred reality for all eternity. And that sacred reality honors our unique personhood. And that's here we are in another moment. I don't have the words that are adequate to say anything more illuminating about that, perhaps. But what a glorious contradiction, that we can be utterly one with and intimate with all beings, all creation, all of our brothers and sisters. And still, like, that oneness longs for our unique contribution to it. That's very much at the heart of the book. It's my sense of the fruition as we're coming to fruition moment to moment in our divine eternities, that God utterly values our personhood, our uniqueness, our signature in the cosmos. And somehow those are both preserved. And if I were to kind of take on your question, then too much communion, too much absorption in the collective body, and we never quite stiffen that spine and say, this is who I am, and this is what I stand for, and this is my uniqueness. I'm trading my integrity. I'm purchasing belonging by trading my integrity for that belonging, and that can become really problematic. And I think I see the way we struggle with that in our body, right now in the gospel as we're growing up. And then the opposite, where we're so unique. It's like, how can I top the uniqueness I created just 5 seconds ago by being even more like the uniqueness can run away with itself. Of course, if we're not connected to the body, the collective body, we can be a rebel, an individual, deviant for its own sake.
Yeah.
So it's a reality. It's the opposition in all things we're given to embrace and hold and live into.
Yeah. This conversation that we're having right now has echoes of development, which you get into in the last one of the final portions of the book.
Yeah. I mean, the last quarter of the book, it's quite a bit. When I looked at the actual word counts, like, oh, yeah, even when I don't try to, I'm spilling a lot of ink on development. I see it as being so in line with our theology of progression and theosis. Like if we're growing in eternity, well, eternity is now, baby. Like time and eternity. How did William Blake say it? That eternity is in love with the productions of time. If we're progressing eternally, we're progressing now. And I'm really fascinated by what those transformations look like in a human lifespan. So I talk about development a lot in the book.
Yeah. And let me ask this question on this. What came up for me as I was going through this section, I'm sure you see this all the time in your developmental work, was wanting to assess my own stage, and then B, okay, if I've got it figured out, then how am I going to get to the next stage, which is my total like Western, achievement oriented, mind centered sort of like perspective. Could you talk about?
I'd be happy to assess your stage on this podcast right
now. No, but the question is, the question is, how should someone approach this portion of the book? Because I don't think that's it.
Yeah. Thank you. I mean, just the question itself is telling. It's so thoughtful and sensitive to how I meant to write about development. In a word, I've been working with researchers, developmentalist people in this area for about 15 years now. I find the models to be very useful, and I consistently find what I often experience as a preoccupation with, like, what's the next stage? What's the next stage? Vertical development, growing up into later perspectives and stages. I think that's natural to an extent, and I think human beings are naturally curious about what we're becoming. But I do have a sense that in every stage, in every disclosure of divine embodiment and reality, there are virtues and gifts and powers and divine emanations. And right now, here's this theme again, right now, not when we get to some other stage, but right now, we have in our divine capacity to cultivate these powers, these gifts, these divine virtues. We've been so busy looking at one axis that I think we've forgotten an entirely different reality that, for all I know, is much more important for our present purposes, to be virtuous and charitable and to move forward with a perfect brightness of hope. These are virtues that are life-changing when we come into contact with them. I've had many experiences in all sorts of situations where someone said, like, the way that person was present with me when I was hurting changed my life. the way that person encouraged me when I had lost all hope, it changed my life. Like, virtue changes the world. I know that. Late stages of development, I think the jury's way out on those. I think it would be irresponsible to ignore them. So I don't ignore them, but I also engage that conversation vigorously as a Latter-day Saint.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know we need to start wrapping up, but there was one thing I really loved so much near the end where you talk about projection.
Oh yeah, projections.
And yeah, and it's so interesting, and positive and negative projections, that sometimes we easily dismiss and judge people and have a lot of negative feelings about who they are, but also sometimes we sort of hold people up on a pedestal, and either way there's a lot of separation happening, and so I loved hearing you talk about that, and it feels like it's something that you could practice all day long, because it's so easy for people to fall into to judge them positively or negatively, throughout the day. So could you talk about projections before we wrap up?
In a sense, it just occurs to me, projections are like everything else we've talked about, in that projections are another strategy for avoiding the now. Only this time, the now we're avoiding is like, there's some quality in me that I'm not comfortable with. So I avoid it by projecting it, by seeing it in other people. It could be a positive quality, it could be a negative quality. If it's a negative quality, it's like, I'm not comfortable in this moment with my anger issue. So lo and behold, I tend to see anger. I see angry people. Everyone's angry but me. And the more honest, vulnerable, naked move would be eventually to have a direct relationship with my own anger. And that's really difficult. And by the same token, or by the opposite token, how do you say that? On the other end of the spectrum, maybe we've had this experience where we look up to our spiritual heroes, our mentors, our teachers, etc., and some quality they have just feels like otherworldly. They feel saintly to us. They're so loving, they're so kind, they're so patient. And actually, we're actually getting something out of that projection, and that if they're that good and I'm not that good, well, I can just still be my prodigal son self misbehaving, because I'm not a saint. I'm no saint. But then the moment we see that virtue in ourselves, it's like, oh, I actually am this good, and I have to live up to this. It's quite difficult to have a direct relationship with our own virtue and glory and saintliness. So that's another, it's this theme of being one with all of divine reality. And I think the ways we manage to avoid the intensity of this now. And I want to offer some compassion here. Projection's necessary, and there's even literature that talks about it being healthy, because maybe at a certain time in my life, I'm not ready to take on, like, to encounter all the skeletons in the closet. It's actually a protective function to see everyone else is having problems, but I'm actually okay. Like, it all serves its purpose. And I think one of the themes in the book, something I just came to organically, was that God seems to be drawing us into greater responsibility, greater spiritual intensity, broader stewardships over all of creation. And in my world, God's patience is infinite. And it's not so much the threat of punishment that drives us to improve, but the more embodied we become, the more painful it actually becomes to avoid the now. The parts of us that aren't awake, the parts of us that are avoiding the truth of what's here, it's actually too painful to stay away from the divine. So this gravity, this magnetism of the divine draws us back, and it does it in its own time. And it's the human adventure, and it's remarkable.
Beautiful. I feel like in this conversation we still barely scratched the surface of what's in the book. We have probably 20 more questions written down that we could go through, and just don't have time. So I want to just
have a Patreon channel for like the 3-hour behind the scenes conversation.
So I just want to give you the chance to close it out with anything that you feel is really important to mention before we close.
Well, as always, you two have been so thoughtful, and I'm touched that you took some time with the book to like let it into your body, your heart, your minds, your spirits, and to respond in this way. It feels really gratifying to just interact in this way. I feel full, my heart feels full after this conversation. I'm just taking a moment to check in and see, like, is there something unsaid about the book? I'm curious for you two, book or no book, this conversation, what you're left with. Back to the anti-checklist, like not as a checklist, but something that's just bubbling up in you, like where life is calling you to go. I think to me, that's the exciting thing, that when we open our hearts to divine reality, this spring of living water, it gurgles up and it overflows, and we find ourselves doing something new. I'm curious what that is for you too.
I can tell you right now, for me, it was that word, it was gravity. I think what I was taking in almost every chapter was this idea that there's nothing wrong with the way life is coming to me, and that it like gravity, it's something I can trust to bring me exactly what's needed. And so it's not broken or going wrong or needing to be something else. It just felt like this constant practice from so many different angles to trust what's flowing in, that maybe this is exactly what my soul is asking for. And so in a way, I think by the end of the book, I felt like I trusted this idea of wholeness in a different way, that in that way, it feels like maybe everything I actually need really is here. Even, even these disturbances, maybe this is exactly the work that my soul is ready for. And wholeness, I think, to me feels like gratitude. And that was the feeling of the book, just some real peace about exactly what is, and trust that that's what I need.
That's beautiful, Faith, Aubrey. I'm so happy to hear that. Yeah.
Thank you for the book. It was a sermon.
And for me, it's that word one that I keep coming back to. The word itself, sort of carries these dichotomous definitions. One can mean individual, and one can mean totally, completely connected. And when I look back on my life, I see these sometimes wild swings between the two definitions and what I've prioritized. And for me, it's further impetus to try to integrate both at the same time.
Yeah. Amazing. Yeah. Well, it's fun to interview you two for a moment about the I really appreciate this conversation. I'm touched. I always love to be with you too. Thank you for the time.
Thank you
Thanks,
so much.
Thomas. Okay, thanks so much as always for listening, and we really hope that you enjoyed that conversation with Thomas. And of course, a huge thanks to him for coming on the show. Again, Thomas's new book, At-One-Ment, is available now on Amazon. Thanks so much again for listening, and as always, you can check out more at faithmatters.org.